All right, welcome to the second part of Chapter 3, What is a Game? And yeah, this is part of the Understanding Video Games public lecture series hosted by me, Benjamin, and I'd say we'll just get right on. Yeah, today we're going to talk about formal definitions, pragmatic definitions, and the issue of genre within the third chapter regarding the question, what is a game? Last time we talked about general models for understanding games. Remember stuff like the magic circle or games as cultural reflections or role-playing. So games as role-playing according to Mead. So we looked over various models on trying to understand what the phenomena of games are really about. And today we're going to talk about formal definitions and pragmatic definitions, and then about genre. And if you remember, formal and pragmatic definitions, or rather formal definition, were something that always referred to the game itself, trying to set up universal principles that hold up for a game. So with that, we will start, or at least the book goes on with David PARLETT. David PARLETT is a board game expert and historian. I had the pleasure to have a brief talk with him on the International Board Game Colloquium, a great guy, an amazing scholar. And I was really happy to find him also in the Understanding Video Games book, as he has contributed immensely to the study of board games and games in general. And he is here accounted with a formal definition of games, and I'll just read it. David PARLETT, for instance, suggests that a game in the sense used in this book has two defining components, ends and means. Quite simple, but I'd say also quite powerful, has also this very Kantian vibe, Kantian philosopher, see humans as ends in themselves and not as means. However, in games, we have ends and means. So what are ends, what are means? Ends are our goals. According to PARLETT, every game, needless to say, he refers in his work to board games. So every board game has an objective, has a goal, is structured in a way for us as players to reach a goal, whether that is defeating the other player or reaching the end of a map, owning everything like in Monopoly, or in Ludo, where you try to, which is a racing game where you try to get to the end, or in chess or Age of Empires, as it's written here, you try to defeat your enemy. However, you cannot just defeat your enemy. There are certain means that the game provides you with in forms of rules and possibilities, and these means are our means to play the game, to eventually win the game. In Age of Empires 2, which is a strategy game, a real-time strategy game, our goal is to defeat the enemy fraction, and for that we are provided technologies, resources that we can harvest and exploit to build up a city or a camp in which we can then recruit soldiers and other units in order to create an army with which we can overwhelm the enemy that we are fighting, whether it's an AI or an actual real human player. So, and in that regards, David PARLETT looks at games as dependent on these two entities, namely that we have a goal and we have means or ways to achieve this goal. So if our objective is to defeat a player, the game provides us with means, so resources to build up an army, etc., to then take on our enemy, defeat the enemy, and win the game. This has some flaws if you regard games such as Minecraft or other walking simulators such as Gone Home or Firewatch, where there isn't necessarily a goal, or The Sims, World of Warcraft, but rather people play it to be part of the process of playing that game. And we will talk about that when we'll be talking about process-oriented games. Point is, not all games provide you with ends. I cannot think of games that don't provide you with any means, but if you can think of anything, just drop it in the comments. Another definition is by Bernard Suits, or suits, maybe like the suits to wear. And it is said, to play a game is to engage in activity directed towards bringing about a specific state of affairs using only means permitted by rules, and where the rules prohibit more efficient in favor of less efficient means, and where such rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. Bit of a weird phrasing for me, being German and not a native speaker. Sounds quite poetic. So this can be in a way regarded as an elaboration or a more detailed or reworked version of David Parlett's ends and means. So instead of ends, Suits replaces these ends with a specific state of affairs. So it doesn't matter whether it's an objective that or a goal that we try to reach. The point is just that a game is about changing the state of how things, or the situation within the game. If we interact with the game, let's say with the game of chess, our goal, like by moving a figure, by moving a pawn, we change the state of affairs. So each turn, each interaction we do does bring about a specific state of affairs. The same with games such as Mario Kart Double Dash or other video games where we interact and we constantly change the state of affairs. This is very helpful as it's not that much about this end goal that we're trying to achieve. And using only means permitted by rules. So this state of affairs can only be brought by specific movements or interactions that are governed by a rule set of the game. In chess, we cannot move several, we cannot move diagonal or several fields, where depending on where we are, we cannot move back. We cannot just like jump from one field to the king or queen. That is not possible because the rules don't permit for that. In Mario Kart Double Dash, we cannot just in order to shorten the map or shorten our journey to the finish line, we cannot just go over here on the left side, as this blocks our way. Also, there are places where there are like sand traps where you cannot, where the game kind of slows you down in order not to allow you to go too fast towards the finish line. So these rules, so the game tries to keep our movement, our interactions in check, so that the specific state of affairs that we desire cannot be achieved trivially. So there needs to be done some form of effort. It needs to be somehow challenging for us to move in. I find this definition very helpful, and as it is broad enough to account for various aspects, and it does very well address this specific state of affairs, which could be anything. At the same time, this vagueness might be not the best thing to analytically discuss something, but it gives you an overall idea, and it really helps to account for many games. And I'd say probably all games I can think about that would more or less work with this definition, but eventually in-depth analysis of what's going on in the game might be difficult, but it is helpful in trying to find a definition for the overall phenomenon of games. here we have now Chris CRAWFORD, which is more or less who was a game designer and wrote a book in the 80s, which was way ahead of its time, The Art of Game Design. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was written in the mid 80s and was then rediscovered by game study scholars. Which is, I think, something very good, that in game studies we do not only consider the works of other scholars, but also appreciate the work of non-scholars, of thinkers, and especially game designers. And Chris CRAWFORD doesn't have like fixed sentence that tries to encapsulate what games are, but he refers to games as having 4 distinct aspects that all games have in common, or all good games, according to him, or here referring to video games especially. And he talks of representation, interaction, conflict, and safety. With representation, what is meant is that CRAWFORD refers to games as representing always something else. So if you think, to take again the example of chess, in a way, we could reduce chess to its mathematical components. We wouldn't need to have figures that represent kings and queens, but just figures in different sizes. And in a way, the game represents also a medieval period, a bygone era. And this also refers to other games such as role-play games that also represent different things. There has been the criticism that not necessarily things represent something else themselves, such as that Super Mario, I think, is given as an example in the book. I don't understand this criticism, because how does Super Mario not represent something else than the game of Super Mario, as we have an Italian plumber saving a princess, which has like this sexist dimension, of course, that it in a way represents. CRAWFORD does respond to that, basically saying that it doesn't have to be an universal representation. He says that when talking about representations, we're talking about subjective representations. So game always represents something to the individual player. There's always it always signifies something else, either an emotion, a phenomenon, a memory, a metaphor, something in that regards. Games, another aspect that is crucial for games is interaction, right? There cannot be a full experience of playing a game without interacting with the game. Interesting to contrast with the hype and phenomenon of watching YouTubers and streamers that they're playing, as we passively look at people playing. Nothing unusual, though. There are a lot of social theories that explain that. Well, no time for that here in this lecture. So with interaction, it's very simple. If you think about Bernard Suits, right, we're bringing on a different state of affairs, and doing that needs us to engage with the game, interact with the game, with a controller, with a keyboard, with a joystick, with whatever, but we do interact with the game. We change the state of affairs and, bring on a dynamic relationship, a haptic relationship that we have with games. Conflict. Not necessarily conflict as you would associate it involving war and fighting. With conflict, CRAWFORD means that we are playing a game and obstacles are there that hinder us to trivially traverse the game space. So we cannot just win this game of chess by moving our pawn somewhere else, but we have an enemy player who does moves which poses then more normative conflict. But if you think about a jump and run game like Mario, we have heights, so we have to jump. There are moving platforms that pose in a way obstacles that not necessarily attack us, but provide obstacles that provide a conflict of interest, right? We want to change the state of affairs for our favor to a desirable outcome. And the game design or the level design poses various forms of conflicts through obstacles or enemies within the game space. And safety is the last aspect CRAWFORD names, and safety is us playing and being in a safe environment. Now, this is problematic for some reasons, but let's start first with what CRAWFORD means, which is that whenever you play a game, you are in a state of safety on two dimensions. The first dimension is that you're protected by its rules. So usually you would expect, so if you're playing a game of Quake or Doom or Age of Empires, you are safe by anything that is external to the game, according to CRAWFORD. There is nothing that can intrude the game, no hackers alike. In an ideal world, there would be no problem that creeps into the game and would change and modify the rules. This is why we react with such frustration if people are cheating or are spoil sports who contest the rules of a game and change this safety that we are in as we depend on these rules to function in a normal way. On a second dimension, CRAWFORD refers to the simple fact that I can shoot other people in a game, in a virtual space, while sitting in my living room or in my office or in whatever physical safe space. So games are usually played in a safe environment for various reasons. We need to focus on the game, right? Playing while working as a as a parcel delivery serviceman or as a border guard officer, think about Papers, Please, might be not the best place to play any games. Therefore, we always choose a place of safety. However, I contest this notion, and I think, if I remember right, it has been also contested in the chapter, as if you think about games such as football or soccer, these games are in a dangerous environment, or ice hockey, where things dynamically happen and things can happen, conflict can excel to the point where we are physically harmed. Think about all of these football and ice hockey players who have broken limbs or other kinds of or seizures from playing. So things can happen easily. Just think about Squid Games. Okay, that is a movie, but I think you get the idea that there are also a game of airsoft where we shoot each other, laser tag where it's so dark we could run into each other. So safety might be a thing when we're sitting in front of a console, but once games become physical, I think there is this aspect of safety isn't anymore aware. Okay, one could argue that Chris CRAWFORD referred on video games, but then how safe are highly competitive esports player from failure, from the anxiety of being in the finals and letting down all of your thousands of fans? I don't think that, especially in regards to competitive environments, if we consider only physical safety, yes. If we consider also mental, psychological well-being, no. Because a game of League of Legends can also decrease my mental health by the toxicity and flaming that is going on, that will also maybe encourage me to flame and be toxic myself, right? Who isn't without sin shall throw the first stone. Still an interesting and very, very pioneering, ahead of its time approach towards identifying core attributes within our relationship to games. Chris CRAWFORD. The last two formal definitions that we will have a look at are very close to each other, and we begin now with Katie SALEN and Eric ZIMMERMAN. The first was suggested in 2003 by game theorists Katie SALEN and Eric Zimmerman. Remember these names, they are very important figures in game studies in their book Rules of Play. A game is a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in quantifiable outcome. This can be seen as a mix between CRAWFORD and Bernard's suits in a way. So instead of having the state of affairs is equalized with an artificial conflict. Conflict is always dynamic, which implies the state of affairs, and we engage with an artificial conflict as there is no conflict. If I play Battlefield Bad Company 2, it is not like I need to really defend my country or I need to invade a country, but I engage voluntarily in an artificial conflict for fun, for entertainment, for immersion, for whatever kind of motivation you as a player might have to engage with an artificial conflict. This conflict, however, is defined by rules. Otherwise, it would be a frustrating experience, would be too close to reality. These rules keep the conflict in check and allow the conflict to dynamically proceed after a predictable and fair way of engaging and seeing change within the game. This is why cheaters or hackers provide such a problem in online games. So when we are talking about aim bots, where players have these software where the player is just the avatar is just aiming itself on players, this can be very frustrating because the artificial conflict is subverted, it is undermined by the disregard of the rules by which the game should be governed. And that results in a quantifiable outcome. That is true for games such as Battlefield or mostly multiplayer games, but generally all kinds of games more or less, as if we win a game in Battlefield, an online game, we get to see our kill-death ratio, we see how well we did, we see other data in regards to how well our team did, we see who won. This is a quantifiable outcome. We can also regard just finishing BioShock and then looking at our stats, what kind of things we uncovered as a quantifiable outcome. In Doom, we get to see whether we found all secrets, if we killed all enemies. That is also a quantifiable outcome. But what do you do when you have a game like Gone Home, a walking simulator, where a quantifiable outcome is not that difficult, not that easy to determine? And this is where JESPER JUUL goes on to take Katie SALEN and Eric Zimmerman's notion to a next level, though if I remember right, they were pretty much at the same time with the same approach. I'm not aware whether they worked together or they had any correspondence or discussion in the early 2000s. Most likely, if you know anything about it, post it into the comments. And yeah, so JESPER JUUL regards a game that a game is a rule-based formal system with a variable and quantifiable outcome where different outcomes are assigned different values. The player exerts effort in order to influence the outcome. The player feels attached to the outcome, and the consequences of the activity are optional and negotiable. Now, this is basically the same idea that we have an artificial conflict or an artificial state of affairs or a sequence of state of affairs that is governed by a rule-based formal system, and we have quantifiable outcome. The interesting addition that JUUL does here is to say that these quantifiable outcomes are negotiable or even optional, or the consequences of the activity are optional and negotiable. This means that players themselves decide to assign certain values. A game can assign certain values, binary values, such as you won a game or you lost a game, you succeeded in a level or not, you killed that many enemies and you found that many secrets in the game or not. This is something that the game can communicate, and there is not necessarily anything negotiable in terms of the quantity or the quantifiable aspect of this binary feedback that we receive to how well we did in a game. But what this means to us is absolutely negotiable. I can play a game of Death Stranding where I just engage with the environment and breathe in the atmosphere and are interested in the story and cutscenes and don't give a heck about how well my delivery score is in the game, and it has basically no meaning to me, and the consequences of that, I do not necessarily have to engage with that on a major level, so I can focus on other things. Same if you think about games of Among Us. How do you negotiate the meaning of the consequences there? Is it like, it's not like in a game of Among Us where we're supposed to find the perpetrator among us, that we give ourselves as a team like minus points for killing the non-perpetrators in our friends, right? It's really about the process in the game. So what these outcomes mean to us are communicated by what these outcomes are in numbers is usually communicated by the game. Some do it more, some do it less. But what these means and how important they are, this is up to us. Civilization 5 or the Civilization series is also a perfect example for this, as how we engage with the game and what comes out of the game is not necessarily like a fixed yes or no, win or lose situation, as we can play a game of Civilization till the very end, and it wouldn't, to some people, wouldn't even matter if you lost or not, as this outcome wasn't as important as the experience of getting there. There are also different kinds of victories. If you think about games with multiple endings, games are complex systems that allow us to, really negotiate consequences and have in a way, have a dynamic and, I'd say, a relationship in which we as players have an agency in not just being subjected to the game and its quantifiable feedback, but us imposing our kind of evaluation of the outcomes. I hope that made any sense. But, well, yeah, that is JESPER JUUL. Also, personally, one of my favorite formal definitions. So just that games are sets of rules, and then elaborate on that according to your own preferences. Now we go over to pragmatic definitions. Pragmatic definitions are are opposed to formal definitions, as they are not really ways to find universal truths about games that hold for all kinds of games and that help us to analyze the meaning of games and the essence of games. But these pragmatic definitions are more or less of a way of looking at games that allows you to make better games. Pragmatic definitions are definitions that are mostly used by game designers and are very fruitful in game design, can be also very fruitful in game analysis, as we can see, but are more focused on the pragmatic nature of game. So what makes a good game and how can we make a good game? And one of the most famous pragmatic definitions is a game is a series of interesting choices, as we know from Sid Meier, the creator of the Civilization series. And for him, it is that a good game is defined by which choices we are given as a player and whether these choices are meaningful. And this can be true for some games, such as Civilization, This War of Mine, Papers, Please, Detroit Become Human, you name it. But it is not necessarily true for games such as Call of Duty. why, like, I don't think that it is an interesting choice for us whether we shoot that enemy or not. It is an rather be killed or kill situation, and it's not really an interesting choice that we have over there. Doesn't make it a bad game, right? But Sid Meier, and in regards to this being a pragmatic definition, is not interested in accounting for all games. It is just interested in providing way of looking at things in order to produce or create a specific kinds of games. I don't think Sid Meier would be interested in creating multiplayer shooter games, but more games such as Civilization, where you have choices. So in sticking to this definition, it also more or less limits you to what you can do, but it allows you way better to do what you want to really achieve. So game is a series of interesting choices, depending on the game. Another very interesting definition and analytical tool is by Robin HUNICKE, Marc LeBlanc, and Robert ZUBEK. ZUBEK also published recently a very great book on game design that I recommend. I'll post it maybe into the description box. Yeah, and this is a pragmatic definition by game designers and developers themselves. So, always keep in mind who makes these definitions. Are there academics or are those actually designers? Because, yeah, that kind of determines how these people approach games and what they hope to achieve by having definitions. And here we have games being reduced, or the gameplay experience reduced to a network of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, or an interrelation between these components. Mechanics being the rules and basic code of the game. So this is the interior structure of the game itself, so the binary code in which the game is written, the hard code, and the game within its engine. So a game that has been produced in a system that relates game objects to each other and allows them to dynamically function in a video game. And these mechanics that are the basis on which dynamics are created. And dynamics is the way the game actually plays based on the mechanics. So if we interact with the game, we don't see the binary code that is behind the screen, that is within the game system, that is within the code, within the software, but the game does allow us to see a representation of our interaction. So in World of Warcraft, I can move, and our keyboard will send the signal to the system, to the code that we're moving, and according to how the code has been done, we receive feedback in form of an dynamic representation of us moving. Or the same, you can go for attacking, fighting, casting spells, and these are dynamics happening on the screen. And these dynamics create aesthetics. And aesthetics, according to HUNICKE, LeBlanc, and ZUBEK, covers the favorable emotional responses evoked in the player. So mechanics allows us to interact with the game that then create dynamics as a form of feedback. And this form of feedback creates an aesthetic experience that creates an emotional response. So we can feel, by the dynamic created that we engage with, we can feel challenged. But we can also feel a sense of companionship. In World of Warcraft, we can have pets, and we can develop relationships to our pets, which gives us a sense of companionship, seeing the dynamics on the screen when the pet is running around us, leveling the pet, and so on. So interacting and creating dynamics in the games creates an emotional response, and this is what good games, according to many game designers out there, are supposed to do, namely evoke emotional responses. And here there are many kinds of emotional responses. They name 8. I won't name them all, but from anger to companionship to challenge to affection, all kinds of forms of emotional responses are created by aesthetics. This tool is very interesting to look at games from a, as it says, pragmatic perspective, and it allows also game designers to analyze their games, especially when things don't work. So the MDA model, this is how it's called, Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics, is usually maybe used to create games, but it is mostly used to see why the favored aesthetics did not happen. Was it a problem in the dynamics or the mechanics? Usually everything is then traced back to the mechanics and back and forth. So it's a really good analytical tool to see for game developers why a certain aspect of their game didn't work out as they expected when coding or developing that game. So yeah, MDA model, something very interesting and still widely accepted. Okay, so our last aspect will be the issue of genre. And with the issue of genre, bring a new form of dimension into this aspect of what is a game. So we talked about general models of thinking about play. So what play means in a human and social sense. What is the meaning? Why do games even exist? Then we looked at pragmatic and formal definitions on trying to find ways to pinpoint valid aspects of a game that can be either used to analyze a game within its, or what it means in its given framework, or whether this holds for all kinds of games. And then we have these pragmatic aspects, which is that doesn't matter what a game is, but most important is that these are aspects of a game that tend to work. And in regarding these, you can create new games that are challenging, engaging, immersive, what's not. There is now this third dimension of genre, which is a bit difficult to wrap your head around. So, and Mark Wolf was the person, a great game historian, who has, kind of pinpointed towards that fact. In a video game, there is almost always a definite objective that the player strives to complete, and in doing so, very specific interactions are used. Thus, the intention of the player character, at least, is often clear and can be analyzed as part of the game. So, essentially, what Mark Wolf says is that, all right, so games can be this and that and whatever, but but every game most video games, or every video games have almost always a definite objective. So if we have Call of Duty, our goal is to defeat our enemies. If we have BioShock, it is true to find out what really happened in Rapture. And the game itself, whatever it is, regardless of valid formal definitions, allows us to interact only in a specific way. So it allows us to interact only with a specific rule-based way in a given environment. It allows for a certain kind of interactivity. Keep that word in mind, interactivity. Maybe I should have written that down, but well, trying to keep these slides clean. So what a game really is really depends on how the game lets us interact with the game, because the game has no meaning outside of the player's perception. If we cannot interact with the game, if we do not interact with the game, we don't really get an idea of what that game is about. So interactivity is at the focus of that whole process. And the kinds of interactivity is then being referred to then as genre. The genre can be seen as a marketing tool to categorize games and then create expectations within consumers to be like, this is an action game, this is an adventure game. But genre operate fundamentally under the aspect of interactivity. If we think about an action game, which is about, dynamically moving objects, fighting, challenge, conflict, and, haptic responses, fast-paced responses, is also the fundamental way in which the game allows us to interact with. Henceforth, it is categorized as an action game such as God of War 1 or Call of Juarez Gunslinger, where it's really about this aspect of interactivity. Unfortunately, I have to rush now through this because I got an appointment and I hadn't time enough to get settled because I was kicked out of my office. So please forgive me on being rushing towards now the final slides. And yeah, we have that. So the main genres are action games, but also adventure games, which are games fundamentally allows us to interact in a more slow-paced way, in which our goal is to find out what happened. We're on an adventure and solving mysteries and engaging like more with the narrative. And it also allows for a specific mode of interaction. So here we don't interact dynamically simply because it is not important. In adventure games such as the early Colossal Cave Adventure, from which these games have their name, or The Secret of Monkey Island, our goal is to find out what happened and solve a mystery, or solve or traverse through the game space by solving riddles and puzzles. So this allows for a specific way of interaction. Strategy games have a different objective. We control vast resources and we have to manage them in order to to win a game. And for that, we need to develop long-term strategies and cannot only respond to short-term conflicts so we always need to keep this long durée aspect in mind, such in games as Total War games in general, but also Dawn of War, but also games such as Civilization, where you develop long-term strategies to achieve your goals. And again, here a different mode of interactivity allows us to engage with the games. That creates this genre of strategy games where we directly know, okay, we're gonna see the game from above, from an either isometrics view, a bird's eye view, or in some cases a third-person view, and it is more about commanding various entities and managing resources. And in order to do that efficiently, the game provides us with a specific form of agency and interactivity to engage that determines also our expectations that we have when we think about strategy games. Other games are process-oriented games, and these can be many things. I mentioned that at the beginning of this lecture in regards to no, I don't remember in regards to which game I mentioned that, but here I got Sims 3 and Euro Truck Simulator. Completely different games, but what combines them is that most players do play these games because that they're not necessarily interested in an end goal, but the process. So it's really about the way is the goal. And many games can be like that. If you think of Minecraft, even role-play games or World of Warcraft, where these games are not necessarily, or it's not that important that you can in some reach an end goal, but it's not that important. It's really about engaging with the mechanics and being in flow in being absorbed by a certain activity of whatever that is. And this mode of interactivity, which is very varied in these process-oriented games, do however focus on this aspect that it's all about the process. It's all about the interaction itself that players enjoy, and therefore also evoke a certain kind of expectation towards these games as they provide a certain form of interactivity for players. Yeah, these are genres. A big issue for itself. Felix Schnitz, a scholar from the University of Klagenfurt, wrote a book that is going to be hopefully translated very soon and expands on this very, very interesting notion of genre and how dynamic this nature is and how less and little we actually know about genres in video games. All right, so to quickly wrap that up, it won't be a big discussion today, but ask yourself, did you get it? Do you understand general models for understanding games? Think about the magic circle. Think about games as cultural reflections, Galois' different categories of agon or Illings. And yeah, do you understand the idea that that people try, even before approaching games, try to understand what is even the purpose in society and human nature in play and games? Then we looked at formal definitions that try to create universally true principles for video games, and yeah, that are reproducible and that hold for most games. Think about JESPER JUUL. A game is a set of formalized JUULs with quantifiable and negotiable outcomes, or variable outcomes. Or we had also talked about David PARLETT. Games are ends are about ends and means. So how do we reach these ends? And alike. Pragmatic definitions are then mostly used by game designers and refer to which kind of perspective on games allows us to find ways to do games better, or creatively do games, produce them, or allows us to find out fundamental errors with our games that players have. Also then now briefly talked about the issue of genre, and with that being a whole another can of worms being opened up, where it's about where Mark Wolf provides us this notion of interactivity, so that games are really not are really mostly about the way how they let us interact with them, and depending on the way how they let us interact with, they produce a specific kind of experience that we can categorize as a genre. The discussion questions for today are consider Marshall McLuhan's idea of games as cultural reflections and discuss how well it applies to sports or other games that are popular in your area. Game and media critic Henry Jenkins has argued that game designers should concentrate on exploring the aesthetics of action instead of trying to imitate other media. Do you agree with this statement? Why or why not? Consider several recent video games and discuss their design in terms of this issue. Using data available online, find out what the current best-selling games are, discuss to what extent these titles borrow from movies, whether in terms of form or content. Could any of these titles function as movies, or do they only really function as games? Take a look at the different genre classification systems and try to categorize 10 random best-selling games into each of the systems. Do you think the classification systems are appropriate? Consider whether genre are useful at all, and if so, why? Can you use each classification system for different things? With that, a couple of readings indicated here you might want to have a look at. I apologize for not discussing these questions today with you, but I got an appointment now. However, please ponder on these questions. If you want, engage with them in the comments section. And I wish you a nice, pleasant day. See you for our next episode when we will be talking about the history of video games. Thank you very much.